personality chapter. Now in personality research, we're stopping thinking about what makes us the same and starting to think about what makes us different. And the problem with personality, we're finding out, is that there may be no such thing. Because as we define it, we're looking for traits that are stable across time and across situations. But as we're constantly developing, it may not be possible to find a trait that's stable across time and situation in the normal population. Especially because any amount of stress can change personality. But also because, how do we measure it? So in personality research, it's an excellent time to bring up the differences between validity and reliability. Validity being how well does a test actually test what it wants to test, and reliability meaning how often does it get the same results across tests or across time. So think of it as a dartboard. And if we throw darts at this dartboard just wherever, and you get a random pattern, that's neither going to be testing what we want to test or reliable. Or is it anywhere near the same hit every time? However, if we throw those darts and they hit a certain spot, but it's not the spot that's in the center, then we have a reliable test, but it's not testing what we want to see. It's not hitting that bullseye. So it can be reliable without being valid. However, validity is how well it hits the bullseye. So if we have a random set, it can't be valid if it's not reliable. First it has to be reliable, then we can figure out how to make it valid. And the problem with most personality tests is, are they reliable? Yes, because when people answer personality tests, they tend to answer them the same way every time. Are they valid? That's a problem, because we've yet to nail down exactly what is personality. How are we different from each other? Well, we've been looking for an answer of how we're different from each other since it's as old as civilization. The ancient Greeks had a theory of 4 personalities, and they were based on bodily fluids. A melancholic personality would be moody, rigid, self-absorbed, and this would be an excess of black bile. A choleric personality would be touchy, excessive, excitable, but optimistic. And this would be an excess of yellow bile. A sanguine personality would be outgoing, talkative, happy, cheerful. And this would be an excess of blood. And a phlegmatic personality would be more thoughtful, cautious, careful. And this would be an excess of phlegm, the cough, the mucus at the back of your throat. Now, if one of these personality issues became a problem, as if they had too much, the answer would be to take the excess bloody fluid out of the body. If someone was too happy, you'd bleed them. Take blood out of the body. Now, this would tend to make people not want to be happy all the time, so they would learn not, unless you're going to have someone try to take blood out of your system, or bile, or phlegm. And unfortunately, this was the major system until about the 1400s, until Enlightenment. Now, Eysenck, who's going to be a big name in personality back in the 50s, put a scale on these using the axes of neuroticism and introversion-extroversion. And his use of neuroticism and extroversion as factors influenced personality research for the next 60, 70 years. Still does today for a lot of this. But what makes a person excitable, cheery, happy? But how much of personality is inborn and how much of it is something we develop? That's been a problem to figure out since Freud came along and said what makes us who we are is what we experience in our youth. So a major factor we have to address here, in terms of developmental personality, is a man named Carl Jung. Now Carl Jung, as a neo-Freudian, which means he was part of that Freudian school. But Carl Jung was someone who would give presentation talks. They would call them concerts back in the day, and he would fill stadiums, talking about aliens and abductions and spacecraft and interdimensional consciousness. And while this made him popular in college culture, it didn't make him very popular with Freud, who wanted him to just stop talking about this stuff. So eventually they parted ways, quite angrily as psychologists did in those days. And Jung went on to develop his own idea of what we're born with in terms of how we relate to people. And he named those things archetypes. And Carl Jung believed that these archetypes or innate cultural and societal roles that people inhabit are with us when we're born. For example, how we relate to a father or a mother is different than how we relate to a grandfather or a sibling or a friend. And these roles resided in what's called the collective unconscious, or something we're all born with or hardwired in that we all believe. Now, there isn't really any scientific evidence for this, and understand where this is coming from. Carl Jung was someone who prescribed aliens came and abducted people. But the idea that we have roles that we automatically fill isn't without merit. Because we do have children, and then most of us assume the role of parent. Or when our children have children, we assume the role of grandparent. And we all tend to know exactly what that is. So there is something to archetypes. Are they universal? Probably not. And how do we know something is universal or just cultural? And that's if we go to every culture and we find the same thing or something very similar, then we can consider it universal. For example, walking. Walking tends to be universal, so we consider it a human trait, regardless of culture. So the idea that these archetypes exist in our subconscious, unconscious, or pre-wired in isn't totally unfounded, because throughout different societies, we all tend to have the same storytelling pattern. And the storytelling pattern is, if you've ever seen a movie they call formulaic, it's the formula. Because the very first story ever told, Gilgamesh, has much the same storylines and things in common with, say, Star Wars. And this is not by accident. It's called The Hero's Journey, and it's a coming-of-age story. Just about every Disney movie follows the same formula. And they follow the same formula because it's very successful. It might be something that's hardwired into our systems. For example, think of a Disney movie. I don't even care which one you think of. Now, generally start with a character who's in his or her own home, and things aren't perfect, but things are happy enough that the child doesn't want to leave. The main character doesn't want to leave. But then something happens, and that's called a call to adventure. And something usually happens that the parent dies, or something bad happens to the parent, kidnapped, or what have you. So that the child is tossed out into the world. The child doesn't want to go out into the world, but has really no choice. Once out in the world, the child or main character meets what's called a mentor, the Obi-Wan character, if you will. And this mentor character teaches the main character about the world in ways that the parent couldn't. Then, the character has to cross some kind of personal threshold to know whether or not the character can actually assume an adult role in society. Along the way, they gather friends, usually one familiar friend, like a dog or a R2 unit, and they gather more and more friends as the film goes along. Then, they come to what's called a cave, and there's an internal test. Do they have what it takes to bind themselves together and conquer the bad guy? Or at least to go face the bad guy. And there's usually a bad guy. Then they defeat the bad guy, and they get a reward. Sometimes there's something called Princesses in Another Castle, where the bad guy gets to come back and try again, and then they defeat the bad guy for real. And then the main character returns to society and is rewarded by a social role among the adults. It's a coming-of-age story. It's a graduation. And it's so popular of a formula that, yeah, just about every formulaic movie, including most Disney cartoons, use it. And those characters, those different character types in those movies, they're archetypes. And you'd think that after a while, people would get bored of seeing this movie, but we don't. Same movie over and over again, different dialogue, same movie, really. So Myers and Briggs came together and put together from Eysenck the ideas of introversion and extroversion. And they took the idea of archetypes from Jung and created what's considered the MBTI, or the first major personality test, the 16 traits, in which you have 16 traits. And it's based on 4 axes, the first one being introversion or extroversion, the second one being intuitive or sensory, how you process that information. Are you able to take small pieces of information and create quickly an idea of the world? Or do you need to experience more things in order to understand the world? Intuition versus sensory. And then you've got thinking or feeling, which is how you process that information. And then you've got perceiving or judging, perceiving being you don't act, and judging being taking action, someone who acts a lot. And based on how you score, if you're all the way to one side, then you get a capital letter. If you're kind of towards the middle, you get a small letter. And essentially, they categorize you into one of 16 personalities. Now, the problem here is, well, there's two problems. The first is, there's more than 16 types of people. And the argument is that it's not really fair to pigeonhole people into one of 16 different types of personalities. The other thing wrong with this test is that even though they claim on the website that it's valid and reliable, it has major validity issues. Enough so that major psychology has pretty much abandoned the test. Now, human resources departments haven't abandoned the test. In fact, if you take a test for a job interview, you're probably taking something very similar to an MBTI test, where they want to know, are you organized? Do you think rationally or do you think emotionally? Are these tests valid? Research says no. Are these tests used? Yes. So when they say there's no wrong answer, be aware that there is something they're looking for. And if they have to say there's no wrong answer, there probably is. Now, research into the MBTI showing that it wasn't valid, though it is reliable, because it's self-report. And it's not even necessarily because people lie. But if they take one test at home, and they take the same test at work, they don't answer those questions in the same way each time. However, if they take two different tests at work, then those two tests do usually have reliable answers. So there's no question as to reliability. People tend to take them the same way. But there is question as to its validity. Does it really test personality? Is there such a thing as personality? So then some Australian researchers decided what they did was called a Q-sort. They made little tags of thousands of words and had people sort them into different piles. And what they came up with was the Big Five, or the acronym OCEAN. And this is not without its problems either. But I'll go into that. So OCEAN stands for the 5 factors of the Big 5 factor personality test. This is what they call it. Openness to experience. How accepting are you of new challenges? Now you may relate this back to Erikson. Which one of those stages would it be? The second one is conscientiousness or organization, or how well did you pass the anal stage? The problem with this test is mostly in the conscientious factor, in that they assume that people who are more organized are naturally more trustworthy, which just isn't the case. The third one is extroversion, introversion, our old friend. Are you more focused on other people or are you more focused on yourself? Being focused on other people is extroversion, internally is introversion. Agreeableness versus being contrary. If someone asks you a question, how likely are you to say yes or no? For example, my grandmother, you would ask her a question, even if she's agreeing with you, the first thing out of her mouth would be no. Very low on the agreeable chart. And neuroticism, which is their most stable trait because it's almost there when you're born. There's probably a high correlation to your level of trust in yourself and other people. And be looking for a correlation between trust in other people and your neuroticism about being around other people. And those are the Big 5. Now, there's research that says these are valid and reliable, but not enough to make this single test valid for any purpose of assigning people to jobs, affecting people's lives. No one test is good enough for that anyway, but personality tests are notoriously poor at validity. Granted, neuroticism is pretty long-term, and conscientiousness is pretty long-term, at least the organization side of it. And it's mostly because trust and organization are some of the first things that you learn, and so your rest of your personality is based on them. But we've learned that personality as a whole in the normal population isn't stable until you reach your 30s. And emotional stability is just about the last thing to get matured because it's the last part of the brain to actually finish developing. Now, future research into personality is going to include biology because as we go into the DSM-5 from the DSM-4, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that's how we actually diagnose things. And lately, we've been turning as many psychological problems into biological problems because we're learning more about how the brain works, and because with changes in the healthcare system, we're making strides to creating a biological framework for psychological problems. But future research is probably going to come from the role-playing game industry. For example, the role-playing personality chart from Fallout 4, the SPECIAL, strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. Now granted, perception and luck are the same factor because we've learned that luck has a lot to do with just how observant someone is. But in there's also room for improvement. For example, the L could very well stand for logic, how logical people are at thinking versus feeling. And what is charisma? I mean, charisma could take in your extroversion, your agreeableness, and even a little bit of your openness to experience. So while there's a little bit of evidence that shows that personality tests can be valid, we're nowhere near where we need to be in terms of determining what a personality test does to determine how traits are stable over long periods of time. Also, major stresses can change personality almost instantly. That's why when you're taking a personality test, don't pay for it. Because the personality test that you take online, a good one, may very well be just as valid and reliable as one of the major ones. Only research can tell us more. But to be honest, which Disney princess are you? There's a limit to how valid and reliable these things are. One other major theorist I need to cover in personality, though really I don't need to cover it until we get to therapy, is a man named Maslow. And it's probably a mistake to consider him a personality researcher because we use him in treatment. And he's got this triangle of needs. And the idea is, if someone's having a problem, you go to this chart, you start at the bottom, you work your way up, and you see where the problem is. And this is great with 5th graders, for example. Because imagine a 5th grader in a classroom, he's acting up. A boy, let's make him a boy. So we go to the triangle, and we ask first, at the bottom of the triangle, physiological. Is the kid hungry? Because you know, if the kid is hungry sitting in the classroom, what are they going to be focusing on? The schoolwork or the eating? The food. They're going to be thinking about food all the time. If you get the kid fed, and you check it and you make sure he's being fed, great. What's the next step? Well, if he's fed, does he feel safe? Is he being bullied? If the answer is he's not being bullied, we move up to the next stage. Does he feel that he belongs? In the classroom, with his family, anywhere actually. If the kid does have a feeling of belonging in the class, or in the family, or at least somewhere, then we keep moving up. Does the student feel successful? Because if the student doesn't feel successful, yeah, they're going to act up, and they're probably going to blame the teacher, and they're probably going to blame the school. And the idea is, if this student is fed and not thirsty, feels that the world is safe, feels a sense of belonging, and feels confident and self-esteem, then they're more able to actualize their ultimate self. And this is the idea of humanism, the school of thought of humanism, which by itself isn't an official school of thought, but it is part of William James's theory of treatment. Because it is important to try to be the best person you can be. And there are drives you need satisfied before you can actually feel ready to self-actualize, to become the best you can be. And that's where we use Maslow. So if you see a kid who's acting up, this pyramid is probably the first step.